All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling Venice. Yeah,
Venice.
Venice, the floating city. You know how they even build that thing?
Oh, yeah, right.
Seems impossible. Luckily, one of our listeners sent in this YouTube video called The Crazy Engineering of Venice
Oh, cool.
from the channel Primal Space. So we're going to unpack all that. We're
Nice.
basically looking at how they built an entire city on a swamp.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it?
Truly. I mean, you've got those muddy islands in the Venetian lagoon,
Right.
and somehow they decided, hey, let's build a city here.
Well, they were trying to escape the Huns
I mean, I get it.
back in 452 AD,
Yeah.
but still not exactly the best real estate.
No kidding. So how did they even get started? I mean, were they just sinking into the mud with every step?
Well, it's all about the
Oh,
foundation.
the foundations.
Yeah, and the Venetians, they were pretty resourceful.
Okay.
They used what they had, which was timber, drove these long wooden piles, like 5 meters deep,
5 meters deep.
right through that mud until they hit a harder layer.
So they were like anchoring the city.
Exactly, like giant stilts under a house.
Clever. But hold on, wouldn't all that wood just rot away in the water?
That's the amazing part. The lack of oxygen underwater, it actually preserves the wood,
Really?
prevents it from rotting. So these piles, they've been down there for over 1,000 years.
No way. 1,000 years. Talk about sustainable building.
I know, right? And it's still relevant today.
Is it?
Yeah, like in coastal areas, they use the same technique for stability on soft soil.
Wow. They were way ahead of their time. Okay, so they've got their foundations, but what about the buildings themselves? Were they building skyscrapers back then?
Not exactly skyscrapers,
Okay.
but they did start with wood for the houses.
Oh, no. That sounds like a fire hazard waiting to happen.
Oh yeah, fires were a constant threat.
Yikes.
So they eventually switched to brick.
Smart move. But even with brick, wouldn't the weight of the buildings cause them to sink?
That's why they kept things lightweight. They limited buildings to 3 stories,
Ah, makes sense.
and they used this special mortar called lime mortar.
Lime mortar.
Yeah, it's more flexible than cement, lets the buildings move a bit with the ground.
Ah, so it's like a built-in shock absorber.
Pretty much.
Wow.
And they built the inner walls in this crisscross pattern.
Crisscross.
Yeah, kind of like a lattice for even more flexibility.
Wow, so the whole building was designed to move with the water.
Exactly. It's like building on a giant waterbed.
And what about the walls facing the canals? Those must have been heavy.
They were, yeah, made of heavier stone with all the fancy details.
Uh-huh.
But to stop them from collapsing outwards, they pinned them to the floors with iron rods.
Iron rods. Like giant staples.
Exactly. It's amazing how they thought of all these things.
It really is. It's like every detail was carefully considered to work with the water, not against it.
Right, right. It's pretty remarkable that these buildings have survived for centuries.
I know. They don't build them like they used to.
Mm,
But there's one thing we haven't talked about yet.
what's that?
Getting around. I mean, you've got all these islands, no roads.
Good point.
How did they manage before cars and buses?
Well, for the first 500 years, boats were the main mode of transportation.
Really?
Yeah, just imagine canals bustling with boats, people going about their day.
Like a giant water highway.
Exactly.
Mm.
But as Venice grew,
Yeah.
they needed to connect the islands more efficiently.
Especially to get to the Rialto, right? That was the business center.
Yes. So they needed to bridge the gap, so to speak.
Unintended.
Maybe, haha. But their first bridge was a pontoon bridge.
A pontoon bridge.
Basically, it's a floating platform, usually made of wood.
Oh, okay.
Uh-huh.
A simple solution.
It did the job.
So Venice finally had its first bridge.
It did, but then it got replaced with a wooden bridge, and that unfortunately burned down.
Another fire. Those early Venetians had their work cut out for them.
They did, but eventually they built the Rialto Bridge, the stone one we see today.
Ah, the Rialto Bridge. That's iconic.
It is, and it's supported by over 12,000 timber piles.
Wow, they really love those timber piles.
They did, and over 10,000 tons of stone.
That's a serious bridge. But it clearly worked. It's still standing today.
Absolutely. And, canals have some advantages over roads.
Really? Like what?
Well, no traffic jams for one,
That's a plus.
and they're super efficient for moving goods and people,
Ah, I see. So the canals were like their super highways.
pretty much.
Okay, so we got the foundations, the buildings, the bridges. But what about something essential?
What's that?
Fresh water.
Oh, right. That was a big challenge.
It must have been. Surrounded by salt water. How did they get a drink of water?
Well, at first they had to get water shipped in from the mainland.
Seriously. boats full of water.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
But eventually they came up with a more sustainable solution,
They did, thank goodness.
and it's pretty ingenious.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
You know those squares in Venice?
Yeah, the piazzas?
Those. They weren't just for looks.
Wait, are you telling me they turned the squares into giant swimming pools?
No, not swimming pools. But they did turn them into rainwater collection systems.
How?
They dug out these huge areas underneath, lined them with clay to make them waterproof,
Okay.
and then filled them with layers of sand and stones.
Sand and stone.
Yeah, so when it rained, the squares would act like giant funnels,
I see.
guiding the water down through those layers, filtering it naturally.
So they were like giant Brita filters.
Exactly. And then the filtered water collected in wells at the bottom.
Wow. They turned the entire city into a water filtration system.
Pretty impressive, right? And they even integrated the buildings into this system.
How?
They used rooftops and gutters to collect even more rainwater.
So every building was contributing to the water supply. That's incredible.
It really is. They were so resourceful, finding ways to use what they had to solve problems.
Amazing. But living on water, it can't all be sunshine and roses.
You're right. There were definitely some less glamorous aspects they had to deal with.
That's what we'll be talking about when we come back. Okay, we're back and ready to get down and dirty.
Down and dirty.
Well,
Yep.
yeah. We've talked about the beautiful buildings and the clever engineering, but every city has its less glamorous side, right?
Right, you're talking about waste management.
Exactly. I mean, this is a city built on water, thousands of people, no modern plumbing.
It was definitely a challenge.
So what do? Just toss everything into the canals?
In the very early days, maybe not too far off from that.
Oh, no.
Yeah, but as you can imagine, it wasn't exactly sustainable.
Especially with more and more people.
Exactly. It became a real health hazard.
So they had to come up with something better.
They did. They started building these underground tunnels.
Tunnels, like a sewer system.
Kind of. They collected waste from the buildings.
Okay, but how did they get rid of it? Did they have some kind of medieval pumping system?
Nope. They used something even more ingenious. The tides.
The tides.
Yeah. When the tide was low, solid waste would settle in the tunnels,
Good.
and liquid waste would flow out to the canals. Then, when the tide came in, whoosh, it would flood the tunnels and flush everything out to the lagoon.
Wow. So the tides were like a giant citywide flush.
Exactly. It was a pretty clever system.
But wait, wouldn't that pollute the lagoon?
Well, remember, it's salt water.
Oh, right. Salt water.
So the salt acted as a natural disinfectant, helped break down the waste.
So they were using the natural environment to their advantage.
Exactly. And they also had regular street cleaning to keep things tidy.
It's amazing how they kept the city relatively clean and healthy, given the circumstances.
They were pretty innovative. But even with all their clever engineering,
Yeah.
they still had to deal with the fact that Venice is, well, sinking.
Ah, right. The sinking city.
Mm-hmm.
That's been a problem for centuries, hasn't it?
It has. They've always had to fight to keep the city above water.
So how do you even begin to stop a city from sinking? Do they have, like, giant pumps underneath or something?
Not quite pumps, but they have a multi-pronged approach.
Like heck.
Yeah. First, the design of the city itself helps.
Really?
The canals distribute the weight more evenly.
So it's like spreading the load.
Exactly. And the lightweight buildings we talked about, they help too.
Makes sense. Lighter buildings, less pressure.
Right. But they also manage the lagoon itself.
Okay, how do they do that?
They dredge the canals regularly, keep them deep enough for boats.
So it's like cleaning out the bathtub drain.
Kinda. And they've built breakwaters.
Breakwaters.
Yeah, to protect the city from strong currents and waves.
So they're not just fighting the sinking, they're also protecting the city from the sea itself.
Exactly. It's a constant battle. They even inject materials like concrete into the ground.
To try and stabilize the foundations.
Yeah, like giving the city a little boost.
Wow. They're always finding new ways to adapt, aren't they? But what about climate change? I hear rising sea levels are a big threat to Venice.
They are, unfortunately. It's a major concern for a city that's so close to sea level.
I can only imagine. Are they doing anything to try and combat that? Like, do they have a giant inflatable raft ready to lift the whole city?
No giant raft yet. But they do have some ambitious projects in the works.
Oh. Tell me more.
One of them is called MOSE.
MOSI.
Yeah, it stands for Experimental Electromechanical Module.
Catchy. But what is it?
Basically, it's a system of mobile floodgates that can block high tides.
Floodgates.
Yeah. Imagine these hollow gates lying flat on the seabed.
Mhm.
When they need them, they pump air into the gates and they rise up to form a barrier.
So like a giant pop-up wall protecting the city.
Exactly.
Cool. And does it work?
It's been partially operational for a few years and it has had some success,
That's good to hear.
but it's a super complex and expensive system and there are questions about its long-term effectiveness.
Yeah, and the environmental impact, I imagine.
That too. But you have to admire their determination to protect their city.
Absolutely. They're not giving up without a fight. It's like they're on the front lines of climate change, showing us what's possible.
Exactly. The lessons they're learning in Venice could be valuable for other coastal cities around the world.
Absolutely. Okay, so they're tackling the sinking, they're fighting the rising tides, but there's got to be some other challenges that come with living on the water.
You're right. Like, have you ever wondered how they deal with mosquitoes?
Mosquitoes.
Yeah, being surrounded by water.
Oh, right. Lots of breeding grounds for those pesky things.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of, well, the smells.
Oh, yeah. I've heard stories about the canals not always smelling so fresh.
Haha. Well, let's just say sometimes the salt water wasn't enough.
So what do? Hold their noses and hope for the best?
Not quite. They actually had some pretty clever ways of dealing with both mosquitoes and smells.
Really? Like what? Did they invent the world's first mosquito repellent?
Well, not repellent exactly, but they had an eco-friendly solution. Bats.
Bats. Like flocks of bats flying around eating all the mosquitoes.
Exactly. Bats are amazing mosquito eaters, so the Venetians encouraged them.
By building them little bat houses.
Pretty much, they created habitats that bats would love.
So they were using nature to fight nature.
Exactly. And they also had another ally in their fight against mosquitoes.
Who?
Fish.
Fish. How did fish help with the mosquito problem?
Well, certain types of fish, like carp and goldfish, love to munch on mosquito larvae.
Ah, so they were stocking the canals with hungry fish.
Exactly. It was a natural way to control the mosquito population.
Genius. So they had the bats in the air and the fish in the water, all working together to keep those pesky mosquitoes at bay.
Pretty ingenious, right? It shows their deep understanding of the ecosystem and how to work with it.
But what about the smells? What do they do about those? Surely they didn't just get used to it.
They did use natural solutions for that, too. Lots of fragrant plants in homes and gardens.
Ah, like jasmine and roses.
Exactly. Help to mask any unpleasant odors.
So they were fighting stench with beauty.
Exactly. And they also burned incense and fragrant woods like cedar and sandalwood.
So a combination of natural air fresheners and beautiful smells.
Pretty much. It was all about working with what nature provided.
It's amazing how they adapted to every aspect of living on the water.
It is. From the practical challenges to the sensory experiences, they found solutions.
And we're not done yet. There's one more crucial element to the story of Venice, and it's something that truly captures the spirit of this incredible city.
What's that?
We'll be back in a flash to reveal the final piece of the puzzle. We're back and ready to uncover the final piece of the Venice puzzle. We've explored the foundations, the buildings, the water management, even how they handled waste and mosquitoes. But it feels like we're missing something essential to the city's identity.
I think you're talking about the boats.
The boats, of
Yeah.
course. You can't talk about Venice without talking about the gondolas and the vaporetti. They're not just transportation, they're iconic.
Exactly. They're symbols of Venice.
But they're also incredible feats of engineering
Mhm.
designed to navigate this unique city.
Absolutely.
So let's start with the gondola.
Ah, the gondola.
It's more than just a romantic tourist attraction, right?
Oh, definitely. It's a marvel of design, perfectly adapted to Venice.
Okay, I'm listening.
Ever noticed how slender and flat-bottomed they are?
Yeah, they seem to just glide over the water. I always thought it was just to make them look elegant.
Well, that's part of it, but it's mainly for practicality.
Ionic.
Yeah, that shallow shape, it's called a shallow draft.
Shallow
It
draft.
allows them to navigate those super shallow canals.
Ah, so it's form and function.
Exactly. They can get into all those nooks and crannies of the city.
And what about that asymmetrical shape? One side is always higher than the other.
Right. That's another clever design element.
It always looks a bit tipsy to me.
I know, right? But it actually helps them move in a straight line.
Really? How?
It works in combination with the gondolier's single oar and their rowing technique.
Ah, so it's not just about strength, it's about technique.
Precisely. It takes years of practice to master it.
Wow. It's like a dance between the gondolier, the oar, and the water.
It is. It's a true art form.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got the gondolas, but what about the vaporetti? Those water